Istio 1.10 was released a couple of days back, and there was a new feature called the Discovery Selectors. In previous Istio versions, the control plane has watched and processed updates for all Kubernetes resources in a cluster. All proxies in the mesh are configured in such a way that they can reach every workload in the mesh, as well as accept traffic on all ports associated with the workloads. For example, I've deployed two workloads in a separate namespaces, foo and bar. Even though I know that foo will never have to talk to bar and the other way around, the endpoints of one service will be included in the list of discovered endpoints of the other service. For example, if I run proxy config and list all endpoints of the foo workload, I'll notice that there's an entry for the service called bar. If Istio keeps updating the proxies with information about every service in the cluster, even though they're unrelated, this can slow things down. If this sounds familiar, you probably know that there's a solution for this already. It's called the Sidecar Resource. Using the Sidecar Resource, you can restrict the set of services configuration is generated for. Note that this restriction here is in the configuration only, it's not a security boundary. You can still reach the services, but the configuration for that service will not be propagated to the proxy. So let's look at an example how we could use the Sidecar proxy resource in the foo namespace to configure all workloads in that namespace to allow egress traffic only to other workloads in the same namespace as well as workloads in the Istio system namespace. So let's look at an example. Let's just list the pods to make sure that they're running. I have one in the bar and one in the foo namespace. And then the next thing that we'll do, let's run proxy config endpoints and look at the endpoints for the foo deployment. And you'll notice that there's an endpoint for the bar service. Similarly, if we run the endpoints for bar, you'll notice that there's also an endpoint for the foo service. So let's deploy a Sidecar proxy resource in the foo namespace to configure all workloads in that namespace to only see the workloads in the same namespace as well as the workloads in the Istio system namespace. So if we rerun the proxy config endpoints command against the foo workload, you will notice that the service bar is not in the list of endpoints anymore. So let's talk about the discovery selectors now. The discovery selectors can be configured at the mesh level in mesh config, and they're just a list of Kubernetes selectors that specify the set of namespaces that Istio watches and updates when pushing configurations to the sidecar. Just like with the Sidecar resource, the discovery selectors can be used to limit the number of items that are watched and processed by the Istio control plane. So let's continue with the same example we started with before. I'll delete the Sidecar resource I've created, and then we'll configure the discovery selector. In this example, we're using label env with the value test, which means that any workloads in the namespace labeled with this label will be included in the configuration. Let's label the foo namespace with the env label and then list the endpoints again. You'll notice that there's not so many endpoints in this output anymore, and that's because the only namespace we labeled is the foo namespace. If we label the bar namespace as well and then rerun the proxy config again, you'll notice that this time the bar endpoint is included in the configuration of the foo service. One of the key differences between the discovery selectors and a Sidecar resource is that with the discovery selectors, you can include namespaces Istio control watches and responds to. For example, you've probably noticed how the number of endpoints has drastically reduced when we use the discovery selector, and that's because we only included a single namespace, so no kube system namespaces or any other system or non-system namespaces were included. Without the discovery selectors, all namespaces are automatically included. Both the discovery selectors and Sidecar resources can be applied globally. However, discovery selectors will typically be configured by the mesh administrators, while the product teams or service owners will use the Sidecar resources to configure their own namespaces and workloads. You can also combine the two. You can imagine the mesh administrator configuring which namespaces are watched using the discovery selectors, and the service owners then creating sidecar resources either at the global, namespace, or workload level to fine-tune the configuration.